Our next speaker is Adam Bant. After a career as an industrial lawyer, Adam won the seat of Melbourne in 2010. Becoming the first Green candidate ever to occupy a seat in the House of Representatives in the Commonwealth Parliament. Adam has, for most of his life, been dedicated to public interest campaigning and advocating for Melbourne residents' values now on issues like refugees, health, equal marriage and public transport, and now freedom of speech in the Australian Commonwealth. Adam.
Thanks very much. I watched with interest the unfolding reports of Julian Assange's first bail hearing and noted that the address that he gave in Australia, in Melbourne, is a terrace house in Grattan Street in Carlton. That makes me his local member. And I'm extraordinarily proud to be his local member and to be able to speak in some capacity on his behalf. But I'm also speaking here as a member of a party that believes that the rapid spread of communication technologies has some really exciting potentials for openness and democracy, about which I'll say a bit more later. But first, I think it's important to go back to some basic principles. In the initial days of the Wikileaks revelations, the gut responses of senior members of the political establishment here and abroad spoke volumes about the current state of our democracy. Here we had an Australian citizen who had not been charged, let alone convicted, of any crime relating to the leaked information. Here was someone whose lawyers had written several months ago to the Australian Federal Police, putting themselves on the record and saying, if you need to speak to Julian Assange about anything, if you have concerns that he's broken any law, get in touch. And of course there was no contact. And here was someone who had done no more than make available to the public the things that were being said and done in their names. We had people calling him a terrorist. We had people who wanted to be the President of the United States of America calling for him to be hunted down and executed. In such a situation, a straight application of the rule of law, or indeed the simple words that you find on the inside of your passport when you go home that promises the Australian government will look after you when you're overseas, should have seen our government calling for his protection, reminding people that he was innocent until proven guilty. And to repeat something that I said and that many others have said before some very recent tragic events, we should have sent a loud message to the world, and especially to the United States, that calling for someone to be killed can have deadly consequences, giving the green light to any disgruntled individual to inflict their own kind of permanent retribution. And instead, we had discussion publicly of cancelling his passport, a statement from our Prime Minister that what he and Wikileaks did was illegal. Their gut reaction was not to defend but to attack, and it's here that I get the most worried. I, like most people, I think if the polls are correct, am grateful for what Wikileaks has done and that we are finding out about what is being said in our name at home and overseas, and especially with respect to Indonesia, Papua, some of those events that Julian's lawyer and Julian spoke about so eloquently. And Wikileaks has reminded us that it is essential to our democracy that when force and violence are deployed in our name by armies and in wars, that we are not lied to or misled, and citizens know exactly as much as the government knows before we put troops in harm's way and before we inflict suffering and death here and overseas. But what the gut response of political leaders, or some of those political leaders, tells us is that our so-called inalienable rights stand ready to be waived at a moment's notice. And I think that governments have got used to saying that circumstances are so dire or an individual so terrible or somehow second class that the usual rights and protections applying to full citizens can be suspended. George Bush and John Howard had this down to a fine art by calling David Hicks an enemy combatant instead of a prisoner or a citizen, and by declaring his unspecified activities to be monstrous, he was placed in a legal limbo that took over 6 years to get out of. And in the construction industry, as Chris has mentioned, because of the alleged rough and exceptional culture of the place, John Howard brought in laws that deny workers the right to silence, and they can be hauled in front of Building Commission and forced to name names about who was at a meeting or face 6 months imprisonment. And when they go home from that interrogation, they can't even tell their families that they've been interrogated, or they can get imprisoned for that as well. That was brought in by Howard and still exists. And for me, there is a thread that runs through David Hicks, our immigration laws, our terrorism laws, our workplace laws, and Julian Assange. The examples abound of situations where a so-called exceptional situation means that the usual rights and protections shouldn't apply. But some of our political leaders have forgotten that it is exactly at the times when someone embarrasses a government or says something unpopular that they are in need of the strongest defence, and especially when they have broken no law. And I want to pause here to refer to an important point that Jennifer made about the allegations in Sweden. I think it's, of course, difficult at a distance to form a view about that case. And while some of the alleged activities might not amount to crimes under Australian law, I believe that the women in question have as much right to be heard as Julian Assange has to be presumed innocent. But I also wonder when every government will act with as much concern towards sexual assault allegations as the United Kingdom and Sweden ones seem to be doing at the moment. But to return to the subject of tonight, in what I think can only be a good sign for democracy and openness, I think that these situations that Wikileaks find themselves in, where they're going to be privy to information that is about things that are being said and done in our name, are only going to become more prevalent. As the connections between us build in new, interesting and often uncontrollable ways, so too will the desire for greater control over our lives, a greater say in what is happening, greater demands on those of us who are elected to do things in your name. As elected representatives, we Greens will continue to stand up for these basic principles of equality and liberty, principles that others have been all too willing to cast off in recent times. And we will, for example, seek to amend the important legislation that was referred to, that was introduced by fellow crossbencher Andrew Wilkie, that gives protection to journalists who report whistleblowing. We will seek in the Senate to broaden it to include bloggers, online communicators and other journalists such as Julian Assange. And I have a very simple request tonight for our Prime Minister. I call on the government to guarantee that it will do all things necessary to ensure that Julian Assange and his team can return to Melbourne safely as soon as possible. Depending on what happens next week or the few days thereafter, he may be ready to get on a plane and come back within a matter of days. Mr. Assange has asked for this promise, and you've heard him seek that promise tonight. And as his local MP, I am now asking the Prime Minister for it on his behalf. I don't know if he still has a spare room in the house at Grattan Street, but I reckon there's probably a fair few people here tonight who can give him a room in Melbourne if he needs one. And so, to conclude, I think that all of you here tonight and everyone who's watching us online are, I suggest, standing up for much more than just Julian Assange. You're joining in the defence of some pretty basic principles of individual liberty and of equality before the law. You're making it clear that the future is one of more openness and collaboration, and that attempts to prohibit this kind of activity are harmful and doomed. And you are making it clear that you understand that while it is Julian Assange today, it could be someone else tomorrow. Together with my fellow Greens and with all of you, I hope to do what I can to keep the internet open, increase the flow of information, and to stand up for those who are doing the same. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Lizzie O'Shea. Lizzie is a solicitor who practices in public interest law. She's worked at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, monitoring compliance with international labour standards. She undertook a voluntary internship recently in Louisiana, the USA, with a capital defence office working with Indigenous prisoners on death row. She is now the head of Maurice Blackburn Solicitors' social justice practice. Lizzie.
On the 7th of December 2010, a cable from Wikileaks, published by The Guardian, revealed that US Embassy officials thought President Ben Ali's regime in Tunisia was sclerotic and without a clear successor. The cable noted that many Tunisians were, quote, frustrated by the lack of political freedom and angered by first family corruption, high unemployment and regional inequities. A month later, Ben Ali was forced out of the country on a wave of popular protest. And since then, as a direct result of what happened in Tunisia, we've seen something close to a revolution in Egypt. And there are demonstrations taking place in Yemen, Syria, Algeria, Bahrain and Libya. Now, there's a lot of silly things being said about what's going on in the Arab world. We're told that what's happening in Tunisia is a WikiLeaks revolution and what's going on in Egypt is a Twitter revolution. Well, quite clearly, they're not. It's a revolution of the people of Egypt and Tunisia, and it belongs to them. It belongs to those people who are going out on the streets and fighting for their freedom. Already, hundreds have been killed by Mubarak thugs, and many, many more have been injured. And the inspiring mass gatherings of humanity that we've seen on the streets of Cairo, in spite of this horrendous violence, really do matter. So, these uprisings were not caused by WikiLeaks. They were caused by the same things that always cause revolts: economic hardship, political persecution, and the simple determination of ordinary people to build a better life for themselves and their children. But it's also clear from the last weeks that the digital revolution and the new platforms that it gives rise to, including WikiLeaks, are important, and they have the power to make a profound difference. It seems that Facebook and Twitter are more than just a way for Justin Bieber to annoy us all. If you don't know who Justin Bieber is, I can explain it to you later. The cables released by WikiLeaks made no bones about the state of politics in Tunisia. As The Guardian has noted, there was a hunger for the cables in countries that didn't have a fully functioning democracy or a free press, just like Tunisia. They did not reveal anything particularly new that Tunisians did not already know, but with the help of these new digital platforms, they acted as a lightning rod for the widespread discontent that already existed. Now, one of the dictators that's under threat by the turmoil in the Arab world is Muammar Gaddafi. And in the wake of the Tunisian revolt, Gaddafi offered some of his worldly wisdom about both WikiLeaks and the internet. And I think it's worth quoting in full. He says, "This internet, which any demented person, any drunk can get drunk and write in, do you believe it? The internet is like a vacuum cleaner. It can suck anything. Any useless person, any liar, any drunkard, anyone under the influence, anyone high on drugs can talk on the internet, and you read what he writes and you believe it." One wonders if he's actually ever been on the internet. But I think it's worth reflecting on what Gaddafi is saying and what underpins his attack on WikiLeaks as well. It's the authentic rhetoric of tyranny. He's outraged that the internet allows not just presidents and kings and generals to be heard, but literally any useless person can speak their mind. And in that sense, new media forms are democratising. They allow people to speak. They spread information in a way that the government can't control. And it's no surprise then that one of the acts of desperation of the flailing Egyptian regime was to literally shut down the internet and then try to shut down Al Jazeera. And it's no surprise to me then that the US government is trying to shut down WikiLeaks. Indeed, the power of these new media platforms is evident right here in this room. To get people here on 4 days' notice, and I thank you all for coming, I've been tweeting furiously about the event. GetUp is live streaming this on the internet, and Facebook has literally thousands of members of groups supporting WikiLeaks in all number of different languages. And I'd like to say hello to everybody out there in the square who's bearing the disgusting heat to listen to what we're saying. And even when the internet was shut down in Egypt, Google provided a voice-to-tweet service for people who are on the ground. The potential of these kinds of networks is genuinely astounding. And if any of the more mature members of the audience would like a demonstration in how to tweet, you're welcome to come and see me afterwards. The point is, when Wikileaks provides information to these new digital platforms, and it is information that the government wants suppressed, it's a very powerful mix. It can act as a catalyst, it can break the cycle of political monotony and cynicism, and it can convince people that change is possible. So, importantly, what the cables have done is that they've allowed us to know the truth about what our governments do and say. They act as a barometer for us to test the rhetoric of government against what we now know they're really thinking. And this was clearly true of the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, where the information released by Wikileaks painted a picture of a military quagmire. We were told that this was a war that was necessary for democracy, but in fact it is bloody, expensive and basically unwinnable. Or more specifically, we look to the Middle East again. Wikileaks reveals that in private, embassy officials believe that the Egyptian police and security services were corrupt and violent foot soldiers for the Mubarak regime. But in public, the US government has been pouring $2 billion in military and economic aid into Egypt every year. Indeed, in March 2010, in response to a question about Egypt's human rights record, Hillary Clinton replied that we consider Egypt to be a friend and we all have room for improvement. This is a contender for understatement of the year. The widespread atrocities of the Egyptian regime in particular were once again no secret. Human Rights Watch has been reporting on them publicly for years. But the release of these cables by Wikileaks adds a new dynamic because it shows that the US government was very happy to work with what Noam Chomsky calls useful gangsters. So what is a useful gangster? Well, Egypt for a long time has been assisting the US government with its extraordinary rendition program. This charming system allows the US to abduct people and extrajudicially transfer them to countries known to practice torture. What Wikileaks tells us is that the US made calculated assessments of the strength and the nature of their client state, being Egypt. Wikileaks tells us that the US was prepared to overlook a lot of things in Egypt, including torture, to maintain that very important relationship with those that are doing its dirty work. It's pretty hard to promote human rights leadership to a country which you rely on to torture prisoners for you. The hypocrisy of modern statecraft is pretty difficult to stomach. So, uncovering the truth about what governments are doing kind of sounds like what a media organisation should be doing. And in many ways, Wikileaks seems no different to traditional newspapers. The cables are the brown paper envelopes of decades gone by. They are the Pentagon Papers of the 21st century. But one of the main reasons why Wikileaks stands out so much is that so much of the mainstream press simply doesn't do its job. How many mainstream media organisations think it's their job to keep the bastards honest rather than slavishly entertaining us with a 24-hour news cycle? How many see their role as disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed? Well, one is Wikileaks, and the other, of course, is Al Jazeera. Indeed, Al Jazeera has the distinction of being one of the most suppressed news organisations anywhere in the world, a title it perhaps is competing for with Wikileaks. And the suppression of Al Jazeera is not just limited to Arab dictators. You may recall that in November 2005, the UK Daily Mirror published a story. It claimed that it had obtained a leaked memo, once again, from Downing Street, saying that President George Bush had considered bombing Al Jazeera's Doha headquarters in April 2004, right at the time when US Marines were conducting a very contentious assault on Fallujah. And today, as we meet here, Al Jazeera journalists are being attacked by Mubarak's thugs in the streets of Cairo. Why? Because Al Jazeera, just like Wikileaks, tells the truth, even where the truth is uncomfortable. Indeed, it's worth noting that Al Jazeera has been embracing Wikileaks' tactics of late, as Jennifer noted, with the leaking of the Palestine Papers. These were documents which provide an unprecedented insight into the peace process in the Middle East. Orwell famously said that during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And these are exciting times. What's so exciting is that revealing the truth can now happen on a scale that was simply not possible even 10 years ago. The internet has opened a world of opportunities for the democratic spread of information. And Wikileaks has a very important role to play in this process. It feeds crucial information into this framework and allows us to see the realities of politics. So to defend Wikileaks is to defend the free press, and to defend Wikileaks is to defend democracy. Thank you.
Peter worked as a lawyer with Slater and Gordon, serving as senior partner between 1995 and 2009. He's a former colleague of the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, and Attorney General, Robert McClellan. In the course of conducting various class actions, Peter has been threatened with legal proceedings by James Hardie, CSR, the Australian Red Cross Society, the Catholic Church, and British American Tobacco. All of those cases were concerned with the suppression of information. This makes Peter eminently qualified to speak on Wikileaks and free speech this evening. He's also asked me to say that any resemblance between what he says and any living person is only apocryphal.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you all for being here tonight. Let me first of all say, at a personal level, that it gives me no pleasure at all to stand up here tonight and make remarks which are critical of one of my former colleagues and partners in Julia Gillard, a woman for whom I have a great deal of admiration and of whom I was immensely proud when she became Prime Minister and on the night that she finally rid us of the yoke of the Howard government. No pleasure at all. When something is wrong, it's wrong. And when the wrong thing is done by people who we have always believed have traditionally shared our values and our political aspirations, I think that our obligation is all the stronger to stand up and call it. And so that's why I'm here tonight. Several days ago, the Prime Minister said that she would not intervene in Julian Assange's legal obligations. She said that there was a difference between what Wikileaks had done and the moral force of a whistleblower, such as put Watergate into the public eye. Blowing the whistle on Watergate, she said, was something she could understand, but Wikileaks was not about making a moral case. She said, quote, "It's just putting out information, and whatever happens, happens. It's an irresponsible thing to do." Watergate, of course, is the general description given to the unprecedented occurrence of the President of the United States engaging in a series of criminal acts to cover up the breaking into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate building by some Republican thugs. One might first observe about this approach that if the benchmark for what seems to be becoming the term worthy whistleblowing is criminal or corrupt activity at the most senior level of the government of the United States, two things might inure from that. The first is that many of us might think that that's a pretty high benchmark. The second is, high benchmark as it is, haven't many of the Wikileaks disclosures, at least in part, satisfied it anyway? One of the Wikileaks revelations suggests that the United States government was colluding with a prosecutor in Spain who was trying to close down an independent investigation into the use of Spanish airports for transporting suspects to countries in which the US government carried out extraordinary rendition. According to the report in The Guardian, the US government was especially alarmed when magistrates and prosecutors in Spain began comparing notes on the case. US officials are quoted as saying, "This coordination will complicate our efforts to manage this at a discrete government-to-government level." What possible crimes are involved there? Well, extraordinary rendition has arguably been shown in the past to involve murder, torture and kidnap. And communications between US and prosecution officials in any country, which led to other prosecutors being threatened or interfered with, in many jurisdictions would constitute the criminal offence of an attempt to pervert the course of justice. Now, are these crimes made out by these revelations? Of course not. Of course they are not. But neither was Watergate, when the character known as Deep Throat first began to leak information to the journalists Woodward and Bernstein. No whistleblowing information ever reaches that standard when it's first released, for the very reason that those impugned are entitled to the presumption of innocence and a fair trial. But imagine what might have happened if someone had said to Deep Throat, when those revelations about the criminal conduct of the President of the United States were first being communicated, "You're just putting information out there." Well, what else has Wikileaks disclosed? We've already heard a lot of them tonight. Some of the others that intrigued me were the fact that US military forces have been operating secretly inside Pakistan, that Pakistan has been responsible for a spate of extrajudicial killings, and that the United States has decided to be complicit in the suppression of information about those killings. That while we're regularly told that the policy towards Afghanistan is as simple as us needing to stay the course or not cut and run, whatever those things might mean, down on the ground in the Middle East, the Afghan Vice President, Ahmad Zia Massoud, was stopped and questioned in Dubai last year when he flew into the Emirate with $52 million in cash. While back in Kabul, his boss Hamid Karzai has been accused by his own ministers of complicity in criminal activity, including that he had ordered the physical intimidation of the official in charge of leading the negotiations with the Taliban. Over in Saudi Arabia, courtesy of Wikileaks, we can now read that the government there is the largest source of funds worldwide to Islamic terrorist groups. And back in Washington, the government is suspected of coordinating reprisals against Wikileaks, which include persuading Visa and MasterCard to cease payment services to Wikileaks. This is a flagrant antitrust violation by those companies and by the government of the United States. Are they serious offences? Ask the Qantas executive doing time in a US federal prison. Of course they are. Let me reiterate that with respect to the information which has come out from Wikileaks about each and every one of these examples, I don't know if they're true or capable of being made out in a criminal trial, but they are potentially very serious matters, and the last group of people who ought to be telling us whether we have the right to know about them are the very politicians who might be accountable in respect of them. The point's been made that the demonisation of Julian Assange and the information Wikileaks has disclosed is almost totally unsupported. In fact, it is totally unsupported by the publication so far of any material which might credibly be said to constitute a breach of national security or of any country's national interest, as opposed to the personal interest of politicians. It's also important, I think, to stress that the Prime Minister's formulation of what constitutes a sufficient calumny to justify publication, that is to say the Watergate standard, is not the legal position in Australia any more than it is sensible public policy. In Australia, provided the publisher of the material has not themselves been involved in criminal activity to obtain the information, there's no criminal sanction involved. And even at a civil standard, the most that could be argued is that there may be an equitable obligation of confidence. But even that equitable obligation of confidence will be of no protection if the material is capable of showing that a prima facie case of some wrongdoing might be able to be proved down the track. Which of the examples I've referred you to would not meet that test? It's become difficult to identify which is the most important issue to protest in relation to the staggering exhibitions of abuse of power to which we've been subject in the last weeks of last year, almost on a daily basis. At first, my principal concern about this case was the brazen use of money and power by big government and big corporations to deny information. And as I stand here today, 2 months down the track from when the Law Institute had its first meeting about this a couple of months ago, I'm even more bemused by what could possibly have led decent politicians like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to so compromise the democratic principles which have otherwise been so fundamental to their lives and their career. The sight of these most prominent politicians in our own country in the United States threatening the use and the abuse of criminal law to punish a man who republished information which was already publicly available and had for some time been accessible to at least 3 million people is deeply disturbing. We should all reflect on how any individual would cope with that. The actions and the pronouncement of the US government in its broader iterations, including the references to Huckabee in late last year, are downright disgraceful. The pressure which has led to PayPal, Visa and MasterCard being gang-pressed into secondary boycotts of WikiLeaks, it's frightening. It's too hard to access and to legitimately use information in this country, as Chris Warren has said. Freedom of information laws, albeit there's been some improvement at a federal level, they've become a board game for powerful politicians and their public service. And promises of whistleblower protection that various politicians have made are more honoured in their absence. It's easy for politicians to make big claims of support for whistleblowers in the abstract. It's when whistleblowers like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are publishing genuinely troubling information about our own governments that, to quote our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, is when the rubber hits the road. We need a legislative regime which genuinely supports whistleblowers, provides them proper legal representation, permits a person to make an ex parte, that's an application by himself to a judge, show the judge the documents, and if the judge is of the view that legitimate issues of public concern are enlivened, the information should be disclosed, whatever the source of the document. Too often in recent years, vacuous claims of national interest, national security, legal privilege, confidentiality, commercial in confidence, diplomacy have marked a much more cynical and sinister motive for keeping information secret. It's time... I'd like to conclude by saying that, as I mentioned at a previous forum on this topic, I know Julia Gillard and I know Rob McClelland. I've worked with both of them. They've been good lawyers and they're decent people. That positions of power can lead them to act in a way in which has been described tonight, and the comments which have been made by each of them in the last 3 months, is a salutary lesson to all of us and should be of deep concern. While it's true that the initial allegations of illegality by McClelland and by the Prime Minister have not been repeated recently, in my opinion, the circumstances do call for our government to reaffirm, in the specific context of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, the primacy of freedom of speech, the presumption of innocence, the protection of the rights of Australians overseas. Thank you very much.
We are really in a quite extraordinary situation. Yesterday it was announced, as many of you will already know, that Julian Assange has been awarded the Sydney Peace Prize for 2011 and a gold medal that goes with it, a gold medal that's been conferred by the Sydney Peace Prize Committee only on 2 previous occasions, and one of those occasions was to Nelson Mandela. On the other side, we have statements like that Peter just referred to by a former Republican presidential candidate in the United States who called for Julian Assange to be tried and executed. So much for fair trial and the rule of law. What we need, I think, is now the sort of clarity that our 6 speakers tonight have cast on this difficult, contentious and very worrying debate. I'd like, in conclusion now, to call on Robert Starry, who is Julian Assange's Australian lawyer, to speak with you a little bit about Julian's defence and his legal defence fund.
Thanks very much, Spencer. Well, we're certainly fortified by the support that we've had for Julian Assange internationally, but particularly in Australia. And the pre-recorded presentation that Julian provided gives you some insight to the appreciation that he has for the strength of that support within Australia and in particular Melbourne. This is an issue that clearly resonates within the community. You can appreciate from what you've heard from each of the speakers tonight that the defence of Julian Assange is no simple matter. Every attempt to provide funding for him through the various financial institutions has been curtailed, and the running of his defence is an expensive process, no matter how much of the work is done either pro bono or at a reduced fee. And let me tell you that the resources of the various states, particularly the US, Sweden and the UK, are vast in their numbers. In order that we provide some sort of adequate defence to Julian Assange, we do require assistance. And those of you that can contribute, we look to you to be able to do so. And we ask that there are a number of forms that are available for that contribution to take place and the manners in which that can take place. The funds that are not used in his defence, there's an option of allowing them to be used for the further work of Wikileaks. If the funds aren't, it's not your desire to allow those funds to be used by Wikileaks, then the funds will be returned to you, and there's the capacity to do so. If we are to mount an adequate defence for Julian Assange, we need your support, and I ask that if you are able to financially contribute to do so. Julian will be provided with the video or the DVD of what's occurred tonight. He might be watching it streaming on the Get Up website, let's hope so. But as I said, we can't resist the forces of the various international actors unless we are sufficiently resourced to do so. So I ask that you assist in whatever way you can. Thank you.
It remains only for me to say three things. First, I'd like to thank particularly those people who are now standing in the pouring rain in Federation Square, still listening to these proceedings. You are now free to go home. Secondly, I'd like to say a special thanks to each of the organisations who came together to sponsor this evening's proceedings. Liberty Victoria, the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, Future Leaders, the Victorian Trades Hall Council, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the Law Institute of Victoria and Get Up. This has been a tremendous collaboration, and we hope will be the first of only many as we fight the free speech issues about which we've been speaking this evening. I'd like to thank Jennifer Robinson for getting up twice at 6 o'clock in the morning to first have a trial run and then to speak to us again today. And I'd like perhaps to leave you with a word of advice. I've been advised that the Trades Hall Council has organised a Democracy for Egypt demonstration this evening. The Democracy for Egypt demonstration is a worthy cause, but it is due to finish in Federation Square in about 5 minutes. So in order to avoid some vague resemblance to the recent confrontation in the streets of Cairo, may I suggest to you that you evade that demonstration rather than attempting to run through the lines. Thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you at future events.